On December 23, 1913, just 2 days before Christmas, President Woodrow Wilson signed a piece of legislation that would permanently reshape the American financial system. It was called the Federal Reserve Act. At the time, the signing did not carry the dramatic weight it would later require in public memory. There were no mass protests in the streets, no immediate sense that something fundamental had shifted. Newspapers reported on it, but the tone was measured, even procedural. A reform bill had passed. A new system would be created. The United States would finally have a central banking structure. To understand why that mattered, it helps to step back. Before 1913, the American financial system was fragmented. Banks operated independently, issuing their own notes and managing reserves with limited coordination. Periodic financial crises, known as panics, were a recurring feature of economic life. One of the most severe was the Panic of 1907. Banks failed, markets collapsed, confidence evaporated. At the center of the response was a private financier, J.P. Morgan. Without a central authority to stabilize the system, Morgan coordinated emergency lending among major banks, effectively acting as a one-man central bank. The episode exposed a structural weakness. The nation's financial stability depended, at least in part, on private individuals. For many policymakers, that was unacceptable. In response, Congress established the National Monetary Commission to study banking systems around the world and propose reforms. Over several years, the commission examined European central banks, particularly those in England and Germany. Their goal was not radical, it was stabilization, a system that could expand or contract the money supply as needed, a mechanism to act as a lender of last resort, a way to prevent future panics. The result was the Federal Reserve Act. On paper, the structure it created was careful, even cautious. A central governing board in Washington, 12 regional Federal Reserve banks distributed across the country, a blend of public oversight and private participation. The system was designed to avoid concentration of power, decentralized but coordinated, independent but accountable. The Federal Reserve System would not replace private banks, it would support them. It would provide liquidity during crises. It would regulate certain aspects of the banking system. And, crucially, it would influence the nation's money supply. At the time, this was framed as modernization. Other industrial nations already had central banks. The United States was catching up. The language used in congressional debates reflects this: stability, elastic currency, financial efficiency. There was little suggestion of loss, little sense that something was being taken away. The simplest explanation is often correct. A growing economy required a more sophisticated financial system. But even in 1913, not everyone was entirely comfortable with the change. Some critics raised concerns about the balance between public and private control. The regional Federal Reserve banks would be owned by member commercial banks, while the central board would be appointed by the government. It was a hybrid, neither fully public nor fully private. To its supporters, this was a strength. To its critics, it was a question mark. Who exactly would control the system? The answer, at least officially, was shared governance. The Board of Governors would set policy. Regional banks would implement it. Member banks would participate. A system of checks and balances. Still, the structure was complex, and complexity can obscure as much as it reveals. Another detail often noted by historians is the timing of the bill's passage. It moved through Congress in December, when many legislators had already left Washington for the holidays. The final vote occurred with a reduced number of representatives present. This was not unusual for the era. Congressional attendance fluctuated. End-of-session legislation often moved quickly. But the detail remains in the record, not as evidence of anything improper, just as context, a reminder of how quietly significant changes can occur.
Once signed into law, the Federal Reserve Act did not immediately transform daily life. There was no overnight shift in how Americans handled money. Banks continued operating. Currency remained familiar. The system took time to develop. The Federal Reserve Banks opened in 1914. Policies evolved gradually. Public awareness remained limited. For most Americans, the change was abstract, distant, administrative. And yet, something fundamental had shifted. Before 1913, the creation and distribution of money were more directly tied to individual banks and the gold reserves they held. After 1913, a central system gained the authority to influence those processes on a national scale. Interest rates, reserve requirements, currency supply, all could now be adjusted through coordinated policy. This did not mean individuals lost control of their personal finances, but it did mean that the broader system governing money had changed, from decentralized to managed, from reactive to proactive, from local to national. Whether that change represented progress or loss depends on perspective. At the time, it was largely seen as progress, a safeguard against instability, a solution to recurring crises. But the language used in later decades would be different, more reflective, more skeptical. Because once a system gains the ability to shape something as fundamental as money, questions tend to follow. Not immediately, but over time. Questions about control, about influence, about who ultimately decides how value is created, distributed, and preserved. And those questions lead naturally to a deeper one. Not just what the Federal Reserve was designed to do, but how its role would evolve once it was in place.
How its role would evolve became clear slowly. At first, the Federal Reserve System operated within relatively narrow boundaries. Its primary purpose was to provide liquidity during financial stress and to smooth out the kind of panic that had defined earlier decades. Discount lending, reserve management, stability. The system was not yet what it would become. Then came the first major test. In 1914, just months after the Federal Reserve Banks opened, World War I began in Europe. Although the United States did not enter the war until 1917, global financial markets were immediately affected. Gold flows shifted, trade patterns changed, governments began borrowing at unprecedented scales. The Federal Reserve found itself operating in an environment far more complex than the one it had been designed for. War finance required coordination. Bond issuance expanded. Interest rates became a tool not just of stability, but of national policy. The system adapted. Then, in the 1920s, another shift. Economic expansion accelerated. Credit became more accessible. Stock markets grew rapidly. The Federal Reserve, still relatively new, faced the challenge of balancing growth with restraint. Raise rates, lower rates, encourage lending, discourage speculation. Each decision carried consequences. By 1929, those consequences became visible. The Wall Street crash of 1929 marked the beginning of the Great Depression. Banks failed in waves, unemployment soared, the financial system contracted sharply. In retrospect, economists continue to debate the Federal Reserve's role during this period. Some argue it failed to provide sufficient liquidity. Others suggest its policies contributed to instability. There is no single consensus, but the pattern is clear. The institution created to prevent crises was now deeply involved in managing one, and its influence expanded as a result. During the 1930s, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the federal government introduced sweeping financial reforms. The gold standard was effectively abandoned for domestic purposes. Banking regulations increased.
The relationship between government and central banking tightened. Money itself began to change, less tied to physical gold, more tied to policy decisions. Interest rates, reserve requirements, and open market operations became tools not just of stabilization, but of economic management. Then came another sequence: war, recovery, expansion. By the mid-20th century, the Federal Reserve's role had grown far beyond its original mandate. It was no longer simply a backstop for banks. It was a central actor in shaping economic conditions. Inflation, employment, growth, all became part of its scope. This evolution was not hidden. It was documented in policy papers, congressional hearings, and economic research. But it was gradual, and gradual change is often less visible than sudden transformation. At the same time, the structure of the system remained complex. Regional Federal Reserve banks still existed. The Board of Governors still operated in Washington. Private banks still held shares in regional institutions. Public and private elements remained intertwined. To most people, the system remained distant, abstract, difficult to fully grasp. And when systems are difficult to grasp, interpretations begin to diverge. Some observers view the Federal Reserve as a necessary stabilizing force, an institution that prevents financial collapse and manages economic cycles. Others are more critical. They point to its influence over interest rates and money supply. They question the balance between independence and accountability. They note that decisions made by a relatively small group can affect the entire economy. Around this point, a more controversial idea often enters the conversation. It suggests that the creation of the Federal Reserve marked a shift in control from the public to a centralized financial system influenced by private banking interests. This perspective is widely debated. Supporters of the Federal Reserve argue that it operates under congressional authority, with leadership appointed by elected officials. They emphasize transparency measures, reporting requirements, and the system's role in maintaining economic stability. Critics, however, focus on its independence. They argue that monetary policy decisions are insulated from direct democratic control, raising questions about accountability. Both views exist. Neither fully defines the system. Perhaps the tension between them is part of the design. Independence allows for long-term decision-making, but independence also creates distance, and distance can feel like loss of control. Maybe it was necessary. Financial systems are complex. Coordinated policy can prevent crises that decentralized systems struggle to manage. The simplest explanation is often correct. Still, the evolution of the Federal Reserve raises a subtle question, not about its intentions, but about its effects. When the mechanisms that shape money become more centralized, more technical, and more removed from everyday experience, what happens to the public's sense of ownership over that system?
Control is a difficult thing to define. It is not always about direct authority, not always about who signs a document or casts a vote. Sometimes it is about proximity, how close a system feels to the people it affects. Before 1913, the American financial system was unstable. That is well established. Banks failed, panics spread, credit contracted suddenly. There was no central mechanism to intervene. In that sense, control was fragmented, local, unpredictable. After the Federal Reserve Act, the system became more structured. Decisions about interest rates, reserve levels, and currency supply could be coordinated. Crises could be managed. Liquidity could be provided. The system gained resilience, but it also gained distance. Monetary policy moved into institutions that operated at a national scale. Decisions were made through committees, models, and projections. Necessary tools for a modern economy, but not easily visible.
Most people do not see interest rate adjustments as they happen. They feel them later, in mortgage payments, in job markets, in the cost of goods. The cause is abstract, the effect is immediate. This creates a gap between experience and explanation, and in that gap, perception forms. Some see the Federal Reserve as a stabilizing force that quietly supports the economy behind the scenes. Others see it as a system that operates beyond direct public influence. Both interpretations exist because both reflect aspects of reality. The institution is designed to be independent. That independence is meant to shield it from short-term political pressures. But independence also means that decisions are not made through direct public vote. They are made through appointed leadership, expert analysis, deliberation within a relatively small group. Maybe I'm connecting dots that were never meant to touch. It is possible that this structure represents the best available balance between expertise and accountability. Economic systems are complex. They require specialized knowledge. They cannot always function through direct democratic processes without risking instability. And yet, the feeling remains that something shifted in 1913. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but structurally. Money became less tangible, less tied to physical reserves, more influenced by policy. Interest rates, once determined largely by market conditions, became tools of central coordination. Currency, once constrained by gold, became more flexible, more responsive, more abstract. These changes allowed for growth. They enabled responses to crises that would have been impossible in earlier systems. But they also changed the relationship between individuals and money, from something held and exchanged to something influenced by decisions made elsewhere, in rooms most people will never enter, documents most people will never read in full. This is not necessarily loss, but it is transformation, and transformation often feels like distance. Over time, that distance becomes normalized. New generations grow up within the system. It feels natural, inevitable, the only way it has ever worked. But the historical record preserves the transition, a moment when the structure changed, when authority shifted from a dispersed network of banks to a coordinated system with national reach. Not absolute control, but influence. Not ownership, but management. And perhaps that is the quiet tension that lingers. Not that control was taken, but that it was redefined, moved, abstracted, distributed through institutions designed to operate beyond immediate public view. The system functions, the economy moves, decisions are made, and most of the time, those decisions are felt only in their outcomes, not in their origins. Somewhere between legislation and lived experience, the connection becomes less direct, more difficult to trace, still present, but harder to see. And the shift that began in 1913 remains embedded in that distance, recorded in law, implemented in policy, and carried forward in a system where control is no longer something easily located, but something that exists across layers, institutions, and decisions that rarely announce themselves as they happen.